Добрый
Good afternoon and welcome to the press conference. It is a special press conference. If we didn't have it, we should have invented it. We have a rare opportunity of meeting a perfect panel of speakers at the same table. We've got the counsel to the Russian president and the ambassador of the United Kingdom, Deborah Brunet, and the ambassador of Italy, Pasquale Terracciano. And we got here together because we are getting ready for the Glasgow Conference of Parties. The countdown should have started sooner, if not for COVID pandemic. I need to introduce myself too, I guess, at this point. I'm here as a journalist and the anchor of Vesti on Saturday program. Last Saturday, we issued a warning. For the first time, we are in early November, and this is the first time in history, which is absolutely unprecedented, when the Laptev Sea did not freeze by that time. And I need to introduce myself also in my second capacity. I am the president of the Global Energy Association. We are committed to sustainable development goals of the United Nations, and we support energy studies in traditional and alternative energy, and we are paying more attention now to greenhouse gases, and we are especially focused on combating emissions. And I will now switch to English.
To each other, and we also have with us Nigel Topping, who is the UK high-level climate action champion, who's joining us from London, presumably. Well, that looks like the UK anyway. Given the circumstances, you can't really decipher these days where people are with their bookshelves. Nigel, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Sergey. Actually, I'm calling from my home in Devon, several hours west of London. First of all, I just thought I'd explain a little bit about my role. There's only two high-level climate action champions, so you may be forgiven for not having met one before. The role was created in Paris alongside the Paris Agreement, in recognition by the parties to the UN Convention that we really need the whole of society to move to tackle climate change. So the role is to work with the private sector, in particular businesses, investors, also local government, cities and regions, to drive more ambition and more action. We've launched a campaign we call the Race to Zero. We have thousands of businesses and cities joined that, $5 trillion worth of assets under management. And then to use that momentum to support the nation states, countries, to generate more ambition. And of course, we've seen some very encouraging signs of growing ambition from several major economies in the last few weeks. I guess the main point I always like to make is that whilst of course there is a moral reason for acting on climate change, particularly in our work with the private sector, we're really talking about the inevitable economic transition. And the fact that historically we are not very good at managing these disruptive changes, even though we know that every change in history has gone exponential, from horses to cars, from valves to transistors, from analog to digital, and we're seeing that pick up now. Let me give you one simple example: electric vehicles. In 2016, most people thought that we would still be building combustion engines into the 2070s. Now, last week, UBS reported that by 2024, in 4 years' time, electric vehicles will be cheaper to buy than oil-powered combustion engine vehicles. So the market is now expecting combustion engines to die in the early 30s. In fact, we're all waiting to hear the UK government announce a new phase-out date for combustion engines. And that matters because investors, businesses, governments are making decisions now on what they think the technology will be in the 2030s. So I guess my final point would be, let's think about this as an inevitable economic disruption. Inevitable because the science is clear. I know that this is very clear to Russia, a country with a great scientific history, and the reality that the science is hitting us now with melting permafrost and with extraordinary wildfires in the Russian Arctic. But because it's inevitable, we can manage it. We don't have to be surprised by it, and it will be a geopolitical disruption, and the decisions that we make today will determine who's going to be competitive in that zero carbon economy that is coming at us very fast. As I like to say, when change goes exponential, if you're 5 years behind, you can never catch up. So you need to get on that curve as soon as possible. So with that, I'll hand back to you, Sergey.
Thank you. We'll be coming back to you. Сразу миллион вопросов.
Well, I've been listening to Nigel, and I've got a million of questions immediately upon hearing what he got to say. And Russia is indeed famous for its science, and we've got experts not only in climate change, but we also have good experts in economy. Recently, research came out that if we were to transfer to hydrogen fuel, which seems to be an interesting alternative, but where do we get hydrogen from? Obviously, the Europeans will say no to hydrogen out of coal. There is possibility to derive hydrogen out of natural gas, which is a straightforward and a clear approach. But another idea seems to be coming into fashion these days. Let's use electrolysis to obtain hydrogen, and we'll take electricity that's required for this process from wind farms and from solar farms. We'll take electricity out of the air. It's beautiful. It's an elegant solution. It's just that 1 kilo of hydrogen out of natural gas costs $1, but if you use alternative sources of energy, you need to pay $3. It's a more expensive method. So how do you sell this idea that you need to pay triple to save humankind? But I don't want to abuse my power as a moderator. I want to pass the floor now to Ruslan Edergirev, who will be the Russian representative at future negotiations. And again, we are here because in Glasgow, COP COP26 is being arranged, is being prepared. Good afternoon, colleagues. And today, indeed, we have quite a challenging press conference. That is to say, we have such a renowned moderator, such a competent moderator, that he will keep us at the edge of our seats. We had, there was this excellent academician, Mikhail Budyka. Already in the 20th century, he predicted and he substantiated all the mechanisms and all the phenomena to which we are witnesses today, and we need to study his findings. There is a school that he established, and we derive our scientific knowledge out of those studies. And I'm sure that if we, once again, if we read carefully everything that he wrote, we will learn much more about our environment as it is today. Looking back at 2016, on the 3rd of November, Russia, by the decree of government 2344, approved a plan of action to improve government regulation, etc., etc. All of this is related to the Paris Agreement. Certain regulations and the adaptation plans should have been put in place. So basically, this government decree was a roadmap for everything that's been happening until now. In 2019, last year, that was in September, on the 21st of September, Russia joined the Paris Agreement. So we see here a clear timeline. And Russia has always been consistent in its climate action. We have been very thorough, we have been resolute in terms of our stance on climate change, and we have always honored our commitments. Unfortunately, there are some countries that fail to do just that. We know that some countries first join an agreement and then they decide to leave an agreement, and we have to wait for another cycle of elections, and the whole world is holding its breath, waiting what's going to happen this week. I don't need to explain this to you. I think we're all familiar with this agenda. But let me just emphasize once again that Russia is the country that is consistent and predictable in its policy. In 2019, we acceded to the Paris Agreement, and all countries of the world are looking up to us and waiting for some ambitions. Well, probably 1 year is not enough for us to completely rework the structure of our economy, to change it. If our economy is carbon-based, to switch to a low-carbon pathway, to conduct decarbonization in no time, to change all our balance and switch to alternative sources of energy, these kind of expectations are not realistic. It's not because Russia is not a responsible or accountable country, but there are certain solid reasons that do not allow us to get the results overnight. President Putin, in every public statement that he makes, insists that Russia is an environmentally responsible nation, and under no circumstances we will be discredited on this account, or would we be criticized? Should we be criticized on this account? There are multiple decrees of the government and the decrees of the president, and there is legislation and regulation. There are a lot of business-level initiatives to decarbonize the economy and to lower the carbon burden on the planet. There is a public consensus as well. In the Chelyabinsk region, the party, the Green Alternative, a political party, was voted into the local regional assembly. It tells you that today the green agenda has penetrated all strata of life. It is a concern not only at the top of the political management of the country, but it is a matter that is a concern for the civil society as well. We have also heard from Chancellor Merkel that it is the position of the European Union and this her own personal position that if the countries fail to introduce a carbon tax, this will be considered as a bad faith competition. We have heard those statements made on several occasions, and of course, we had to respond to them. We had to come up with our own plans. My question immediately to Chancellor Merkel upon hearing that was, well, if you say that this can be treated as a bad faith competition, and if you say that without those carbon taxation, the greenhouse gases emissions will be left without mechanisms of mitigation. What about sanctions? We know that only the United Nations Security Council is a competent body that can impose sanctions. So I'm asking Chancellor Merkel whether the sanctions policy will contribute to global reduction of greenhouse gases emissions. And the answer, well, I think I don't need to explain to you what kind of answer was given, and there were references to the Crimea and other tensions, but there is the global agenda and then there are local agendas which can be prone with conflicts or some disagreements. But I want to urge everybody to take the climatic track and the climatic agenda seriously and make it free of sanctions or some sanctions policies. Only together will we be able to reduce the anthropogenic load. If we call to reduction of greenhouse gases, and at the same time we do not enable access to finances and technologies of the developed countries, and if we open trade wars, then never will we see a reduction in greenhouse gases levels. This is a dead end. Those mechanisms like trade wars will not produce the desired effect. Russia is involved in the climatic process at all levels, starting from the civil society, all through the business, and all the way to the state itself. Everyone is focused on reducing the environmental, the climatic burden on the planet. Russian businesses, small and medium businesses especially, they need new technologies and financial resources. But there is a part of businesses that, because of sanctions, they cannot proceed with upgrading the technology in order to lower the emissions. So in conclusion, let me just say that we are all people that are united by the climatic agenda. And at our levels, we need to bring it to the attention of all the leaders, of the government leaders, that the climatic agenda should be free of any sanctions issues. Our objective is to lower the anthropogenic load and to accelerate the achievement of the goals. Thank you. Thank you very much. Let's turn back to you and let me go again to the Laptev Sea. It doesn't freeze, and it's not just a Russian piece of news, it's international news. It turns out that the ice that forms in the Sea of Laptev, it ends up in spring around Spitsbergen. And the plankton that is carried with this ice, it feeds the fishes and the mammals in different parts of the ocean. In other words, climate is something that affects all of us. And although Mr. Eder Giriev spoke about political matters that are somehow they reflect upon the climatic agenda, but for the
I hate people saying the ambassador of Great Britain. Now, the country called Great Britain ceased existing in 1801.
United Kingdom.
It's the UK, of course, and Her Majesty, Her Britannic Majesty's ambassador. The floor is yours.
Спасибо, Сергей, и добрый день всем здесь и онлайн.
As I said, I'm very glad to take part in this press conference together with Ruslan Said-Husainovich and my colleague Pascale Terracciano. Yesterday marked 1 year until COP26 in Glasgow, and this is important because the summit will be a pivotal moment for the world to come together and agree ambitious steps to tackle climate change. That could be our last chance to act decisively to save our planet from the devastating impacts of global warming. COVID-19 continues to be an immediate global priority, but we can't ignore the dangers of climate change. As it was said, this year Russia has seen record high temperatures in Siberia, fueling destructive wildfires, while the risks of melting permafrost covering 65% of Russia were brought into focus by the catastrophic oil spill in Norilsk. And similar problems keep happening all over the world. And Russia can play an important role in tackling climate change and advancing the global transition to a low-carbon economy. Russia has such strengths as a developed science and innovation sector, and its natural resources include over 20% of the world's forests. In many countries, solar and wind power are now cheaper than the energy we get from coal and gas power plants. Hydropower already provides nearly 20% of Russia's electricity with huge potential. Hydrogen is also promising, with some estimating Russian hydrogen experts could be worth $3 billion within 5 years. So Russia has great potential for change, but it has to take action now. As COP26 presidents, we want to work with all countries to accelerate change now. Today, I'm pleased to announce a series of online events to mark the year to go, showcase UK-Russia climate cooperation, and stimulate action here in Russia. On the 12th of December, along with the UN and France, and in partnership with Italy and Chile, we will co-host a Climate Ambition Summit to mark the 5th anniversary of the Paris Agreement. We welcome President Putin's recent call for greater action and attention to climate issues. We hope that he will join us at the summit to bring forward new ambitious commitments on emissions reduction. Of course, the UK and Russia have a difficult political relationship, but the 75th anniversary of the end of the Second World War is a reminder that we have been able to work together to fight a greater threat. I sincerely hope that we can all work together now, so that future generations see us as those who found solution to this global threat. Thank you. Thank you so much. Am I right in understanding that I've just heard an invitation for Mr. Putin to take part in COP26? Yes.
So Russia will be invited to participate in Glasgow.
Interesting. Я до сих пор вел себя невежливо, я сижу в перчатках.
I have been quite impolite for a while. I've been wearing gloves. I'm going to remove them, and unfortunately we are making these gloves with the help of oil and gas, so this industry we will keep developing it. But I've heard recently from Russian Vice Premier Borisov, who is responsible for the energy sector, that BP's transition from oil and gas company to an integrated company is connected not only with the fact that it's a generous move, but also with the fact that Russia does have oil and gas deposits, whilst BP doesn't. So, of course, we also need to explain why the Italian ambassador is here. So, why are you here, sir? Good afternoon, everyone. Unfortunately, my Russian is not perfect. This is why I will speak English, if I may.
And also, as an homage to the British co-chair, I will speak their language. So I'm truly glad to take part into today's press conference, together with the President's Special Representative on Climate Issues, Ruslan Edelgierev, the British Ambassador, Deborah Bronnert, and Nigel Tipping from the UK. With whom we are pursuing a fruitful partnership for a successful COP26. Italy, as you know, is co-chairing the event that will take place in Glasgow, and we have, in particular, responsibility for preparing the pre-COP26 negotiation and a youth event on which I will say a few words in a minute. So I think that my colleagues have described in very clear terms the scenario we are facing and the need for a surge in the response of the international community on climate issues. The current unprecedented global COVID emergency is testing our resilience, but at the same time, it is providing us with an opportunity to deeply transform all our lives. Since last spring, we have been discovering new and more efficient ways of performing our tasks and daily activities. We do not yet know how the post-COVID world will look like, but for sure, there will be no turning back. Many governments around the world are intervening with unprecedented strength and amount of resources to avoid job losses and poverty level increases. These extraordinary measures also represent an opportunity for society to accelerate the transition towards a decarbonized and sustainable way of living based on clean energy and low carbon emissions. Indeed, the transition process towards an economy with low CO2 levels is now irreversible. Thanks to the new technologies, we are able to face the so-called 3D challenge: decarbonization, digitization, and decentralization of production. During its COP26 co-presidency and the G20 presidency, Italy will work alongside its partners to fulfill these goals, create growth opportunities and new jobs, and achieve climate neutrality by 2050. Let me now elaborate more specifically on Italy's contribution in the context of our partnership with the UK. Speaking of which, I would like to show, if possible, a short video. It's half a minute. Can we have it? It's about the youth.
Hello,
initiative.
everyone.
Welcome back to the Youth for Climate Live series. Part of having this dialogue is talking to people from different continents, different experiences, generations.
The sense of urgency, where we are, where we want to go.
Ensure that young people are at the decision-making tables.
When you have youth involved deliberately and meaningfully, the conversation changes entirely.
So we cannot just focus on one aspect of the climate crisis. We need to focus on all the solutions.
We youth are and will be facing the impacts of biodiversity crisis.
Young people are the most vulnerable to these shocks and stresses.
Even in this pandemic, we have been able to hold the leaders accountable.
You have power in your storytelling, and that will help change the conversation.
You actually can shape and influence what happens next.
Young people are not waiting for others to do something.
So participation and inclusion are especially important when it comes to younger generations because of the disproportionate impact that climate change will have on them. We want to channel in positive and constructive ways the youth mobilization that is happening around the world, making young people responsible and recognizing them as key players in climate action. Therefore, in addition to co-hosting the pre-COP, which will pave the way for the final negotiations in Glasgow, we will devote particular attention to the engagement of the youth. The pre-COP will be therefore preceded by a dedicated youth event denominated Youth for Climate 2020. The two meetings are scheduled in Milan from September 28 to October 2nd, 2021. And the Youth for Climate event will see approximately 400 young representatives aged between 18 and 29 from around the world, invited to draw up concrete proposals and contributions to the ministerial negotiations. And efforts will be made to ensure that delegates are present from each of the 197 countries that are signatories to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And in the light of the postponement of COP26, and with the aim to maintain the focus on young people's role in climate change action, Italy has already launched Youth for Climate Live series, driving momentum towards pre-COP26. This is a webinar program addressed to young people around the world and hosted on an interactive platform through which the young participants can share information, ask questions, and submit proposals. In our vision, the preparatory events should be an opportunity to engage all the actors involved in the global climate action. In addition to young people, civil society, the business world, the academy, local authorities, and regional institutions. Our approach needs to be inclusive as inclusive as possible. Winning the battle against climate change will ultimately require the mobilization of all actors. And we are fully convinced that Russia can offer a very important contribution, both at institutional and business level. Lately, we have been witnessing an increasing voluntary commitment of Russian companies in the fight against climate change and the developments of clean technologies. This should be encouraged as much as possible. Now, I could mention a couple of examples at bilateral level, but maybe we can leave this for a second round. Let's just me conclude saying that we must not forget that the transition to a climate-neutral, sustainable economy has a big potential to foster employment and growth. In fact, the goal of climate neutrality by 2050, accompanied by a solid framework of policies, ensures an enabling environment for sound and long-term investments by companies, an essential precondition for green growth and green job creation. Italy's G20 presidency will work in this direction, keeping in mind that if we work together, we succeed together.
Grazie mille, Ambasciatore. Thank you for speaking English. I thought it was already outlawed in the European Union following Brexit.
They still
Or you're only allowed to speak it with an Irish accent, you know. Nigel, let me ask you a tough one, right? To give you an example of how difficult it may be to work with Russians. Now, the Europeans are now in a radical position as far as coal is concerned. Coal is actually off the screen. Now, in this country, 150,000 jobs depend on coal, 150,000. And in fact, the modernization of the industry has been tremendous. I'll give you an example. There were 1 million miners in the Soviet Union by the end of the communist era. Now there are just 150,000, as I said, but their output is actually larger than it used to be in the Soviet times, which gives you an example or two about the efficiency of what they produce and the cleanliness, by the way, of the industry. I've been there. In fact, I visited one of the plants there wearing white gloves, and nothing happened. That said, we all realize the CO2 thing, etc., etc. Now, strangely enough, interestingly enough, it's not the Russian bear which has been biting the innocent Europe as far as coal is concerned, because according to the forecasts, shortly Colombia will run out of its coal reserves. Coal is still required on the international markets, so surprisingly it's going to be Russia and Australia, a modern, advanced society like Australia, which will be competing on the international market. So what do you say to Russian and Australian coal miners, of whom we're talking in terms of at least 300,000, I'd presume, when you say to them that you must lose your jobs?
Yeah, I mean, I think the question's at the heart of the challenge of what is a whole of society transition, right? So, I mean, and Ruslan talked about the importance of predictable policy. That predictability is important for investors. It's also really important for employees, right? That's why, you know, in Germany they've agreed collectively an end date for the coal industry. And of course, what we know is from the way that markets behave is once you've agreed the end date, then it happens faster, because investment stops flowing and people make their own decisions, often supported by state schemes, to retrain for industries which have a long-term future. I mean, if I can give you an example of how difficult it is to resist the economic inevitability. Of course, President Trump was elected on a bring back coal agenda, and 37 gigawatts have been closed. I think a 32% reduction in coal burning in North America, and that's just the economics, and we're just starting to see, I think, the flip in Australia as some very big projects in terms of renewables. Of course, they have huge renewable capacity there, and green hydrogen are starting to be approved. So what would I say to somebody working in that industry? Take responsibility for managing your own transition, because it is inevitable, and don't wait too late, because then you run out of options. But what we really need is what I think many unions are calling for around the world, is a just transition where workforces, management and governments work together to make that a managed transition. Because if it's not a managed transition, then you don't just have stranded economic assets, but you also have stranded human assets, and that's not good for anybody.
Нас сейчас британский посол не слышит. Я тут давеча говорил.
The UK ambassador, Her Majesty's ambassador, does not hear us right now. And I've been talking to the nuclear people in Russia some time ago, and they were telling me that they were the biggest proponents of the UK staying in the European Union, because right now there is a renaissance of nuclear power in the UK, and now that they are no longer part of the EU landscape, it's much more difficult for us to stay in communication with the nuclear industry of the UK. You see how much the climatic agenda affects the economy. Do we have any future in Glasgow negotiations? Can we look, can we find something in common that we can discuss in Glasgow? Well, if you're asking about nuclear power in particular, the French, but the Germans are closing it down. Well, in the energy balance, I mean, you have to find substitutes. You wouldn't be able to replace current energy sources with alternative ones overnight. So for all the energy intensive productions, you need to have stable supply of electricity, of power. So I don't think that nuclear energy will stay out of business, because around the world economic models demonstrate that there is demand for energy. Energy is required, and energy consumption will be growing. And now to the subject of Glasgow. Not just us, not just me, the whole world is waiting for the sixth article of the Paris Agreement to come into effect. Market, non-market mechanisms, accountability and reporting as part of the Paris Agreement, and the timeline for provision for the filing of that reporting. It's one of the stumbling blocks. Last year in Spain, where there was this conference, we spent days and nights at the negotiation tables, and yet we failed to reach consensus on Article 6. So my expectation is the UK, given its political weight and vast experience in politics, well, hopefully the Glasgow conference will enable us all to come to an agreement regarding Article 6. It would have been a major advantage for the business, and the whole world will be grateful. When I hear Article 6, my first association obviously is with the Article 6 of the Soviet Constitution, which proclaimed the leading role of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union.
Рад. Он звучит так. В продолжение того, о чем говорил сейчас господин Эдельгириев.
And in continuation of what Mr. Delkirev has just said. Do you think that the Russian companies will be able to profit from the provisions of the 2015 Paris Agreement already in 2021? If yes, what would you recommend to the businesses and top management of Russian companies? Maybe the second part of this question does not really, you should not be addressed to you, but with respect to the first part of this question, do you expect any success with respect to Article 6?
Ecograd, I think.
Journal Ecograd.
Ecograd. And I don't know whether Nigel would want to come in this too. Certainly, we don't think that we're not asking countries to choose between economic growth and low carbon. We think you can do both. And certainly in the UK, our experience is that we have done both. So between 1990 and 2018, our GDP grew by 75%. we managed to cut our CO2 emissions by 43% over the same period. So we think you can do both. We also think that global economics, and particularly the revolution we're seeing in recyclable energy, is driving down those costs and meaning that countries should be investing in the transition in order to continue to grow their economies while also reducing their climate emissions. But I don't think anyone's saying it's easy, and that's partly why we're saying you need to start now. And don't wait. There's a lot that will need to be sorted out in Glasgow a year from now, and there's a lot of detail that the world, and we've seen in successive COPs just how complicated that can be. And I'm not here going to try and resolve the issue of Article 6, but you know that will require a major effort. Of course, it will. What we're hoping that countries will do now is take the opportunity of the extra year that we've ended up with as a result of COVID to really think about how do they drive up ambition, how do we all use the really serious economic consequences of COVID that my Italian colleague spoke about, to really build back in a different way. But I don't know, Nigel is our sort of expert on sort of how you grow your economies while driving down emissions. So maybe, if I'm allowed, if I can ask him to add something.
I would say mainly by not burying your head in the sand and hoping that the transition won't happen. Because, let me go back to the point you made, Sergey, about green hydrogen being more expensive now than blue or grey hydrogen. That is, of course, true. But we already see a very rapid growth in commitments from around the world, from Saudi, Germany, all over Europe, Chile, Australia, the UK, to investing in growing volumes of electrolysis to be able to produce green hydrogen. So we actually know pretty predictably how costs fall with volume in emerging technologies. So to say that because green hydrogen is more expensive now, we're not going to invest in it and we're going to hope that it remains uncompetitive forever, it would be the kind of industrial strategy head in the sand, which would lead to a country or an industry becoming uncompetitive whilst others innovate ahead. And once the innovation curve goes exponential, which we know it always does, it's very difficult to chase it. You just need to look at the automotive companies now who have been resisting the drive from combustion engines to electric vehicles. Fiat Chrysler have just paid Tesla $1.8 billion to comply with EU regulations. That's not a good way to compete, is to pay your competitor to comply. So I'd say the key here is to plan for the long term and then invest concretely in the steps that allow you to get onto that exponential transition. Otherwise, you will be losing market share in the long term as a company or as a country.
First of all, I'll have another question about Greta Thunberg, Swedish girl who likes to skip classes and prefers to travel with a yacht. But jokes aside, you do organize the Youth Summit, as a part of preparation for COP26. So what's the position of youth right now? Are they positive about it, or are they just skipping classes and going on strikes?
We face is exactly this. We want to make their contribution positive and channel this energy that they're expressing sometimes in a rather disorderly way. We want to put it at the service of a more general and global aim, which is stop the climate change. And we want to explain to them that we have to work all together. There shouldn't be a destructive part in the approach from the younger generation. because there is no, as Deborah rightly pointed out, there is no contraposition between prosperity and environment protection. There are two faces of the same coin. So we want to involve them so that they can work with all the other actors for the common purpose.
Руслан, здесь есть вопросы от журналистов, они пришли еще до начала. Вот, и один из них, вот я на него смотрю.
We have some other questions from the journalists. We're speaking quite positively now about uniting efforts, but there are still people who doubt. There is a question from Severnaya Grani. Much has been said about cyclic recurrence of climate change, that a cooling down period will follow the warming up one, and then there is no need to scare the world with global warming. What are your comments? It sounds quite counterproductive, doesn't it? So, on the one hand, there is consensus. Everyone is preparing for COP26, but we're still receiving such questions. So what do you think? Yeah, this is not the first time I'm hearing such a question. Recently, I've been to a meeting of the board members of the Russian Academy of Science, where our scientists did accept and confirm that the climate change has been caused by anthropogenic reasons. And the international group of experts that includes experts and specialists who generalize all the knowledge obtained in the world. So this group also confirms that 99.9%, almost 100%, climate change has been caused by anthropogenic reasons. There have been other reasons. Isotopic causes of CO2 emissions. So we can actually trace where CO2 emissions come from. We can trace where they were caused by human activity or whether those emissions were caused by something else. So according to isotopic analysis, these CO2 emissions were caused by combustion. So they were caused by the combustion of the fossil fuels. So, of course, there is reaction by community. Our planet and our climate is so well balanced. Maybe some people believe in some forces like God, maybe the others believe in science and civilization. This is all so finely tuned, and this balance has to be maintained. So, by our actions, we may indeed break this finely tuned balance. When the cycle reaches its peak, and it is supposed to go down, but because of our influence, it sometimes keeps going up. We can change this natural cycle hypothetically. So the global science community is convinced that this climate change has been caused by anthropogenic reasons, and we are risking, and the risks are very high. And of course, there is still a lot to research in this field, but in the majority of cases, the majority of experts state that the climate change has been caused by anthropogenic reasons. Long time ago, when we didn't have to wear masks, I flew from Rome to Dublin, and all Europe was covered with clouds. And then I saw a hole in those clouds, and we were actually flying above La Manche. And British huge fields of windmills, wind power generators. So are they actually moving those clouds? That's what I thought. But actually, jokes aside, of course I was joking. Jokes aside, many things aimed at decarbonization that are done in developed countries are done based on providing governmental money for these spheres. And when you come with such ideas to Africa, to Latin America, and you tell them, let's use wind energy or solar energy for your electricity, but you won't have any money from the government, so you'll have to pay quite a lot for that. This becomes quite a weird conversation. Here we have representatives from the UK, from Italy, from Russia, and we basically speak the same language. But what would happen when we start talking to the developing countries? Do you think we will be able to reach consensus and to reach the same understanding? Nigel, the question is mainly for you.
First of all, there's still a lot of subsidies supporting the fossil fuel consumption around the world. So those are subsidies which are actually subsidizing pollution. So I think we can expect to see those being reduced and removed in the near future. Second of all, it's also a question of where we're at on the technology learning curve. You know, solar and wind have come down massively in the last 10 years. So whilst they might have needed subsidies 10 years ago as they were early stage technologies where we needed to get the learning process going, increasingly around the world, we don't need those subsidies. So renewable energy is now the cheapest form of producing electricity in around about 3/4 of the regions of the world. So I think that if that early stage investment is driven by developed countries, as it has been largely in the case of wind and solar, or developed and developing, including China, of course, which is in a big driver of volume, then as the costs come down, then you're not actually asking those developing countries in sub-Saharan Africa or in Southeast Asia to make that choice. It actually becomes the logical, the rational choice. You may have seen just last week, Vietnam, for example, has just put a moratorium on all future coal-fired power station builds. So that's, yes, driven by climate change and pollution, but increasingly also driven by the economics. So I don't think it's early on it is a choice. You have to decide whether you're going to invest in as a government, but once you've got past the technological tipping points, then the economics takes care of it, and then you don't have that dilemma that I think you're alluding to in developing economies.
Вопрос от того же журнала «Экоград» для обоих послов.
Another question from the same journal to both the ambassadors. It's quite a tricky one. In Italy, actually, in Italy, GHG emissions exceeds absorption 3 times. In the UK, the difference is 6-fold. Russia emits 5 times less than what its territory allows it to sequester. Why should Russia reduce emissions before other countries bring their balance to equilibrium?
So I would say I would want to make sort of 3 points. I think first of all, we're asking all countries. This is us as the co-chairs of the Conference of the Parties 26. We're asking all countries to increase their ambition. It is aimed at Russia because Russia is party to the Paris Agreement, which is a positive thing. But we're talking to everybody. Certainly, Russia's forests are, I think, you know, an incredible resource, not just for Russia, but for the whole world. It's a really positive thing. And But I think Russia, at least according to my figures, Russia, like all countries, apart from Bhutan and Suriname, Russia is a net emitter of carbon, even taking into account its forests. And certainly my understanding is that the per capita emissions from Russia are about double what they are for the UK. So I don't recognise the figures, and I'm afraid I don't know the Italian figures.
I think the World Bank data is somewhere there. Yeah, I think.
But Russia's forests are a fantastic asset. There are issues about how you manage forests over the long term, and yet there are ways you can manage forests in order to increase the carbon absorption. And I think that's one of the challenges for Russia, particularly as temperatures increase and pressures on forests increase with the things like the terrible fires that we saw and were alluded to earlier. So I think my points are, firstly, we're asking, it's not Russia, it's everyone we're asking to take action. Secondly, I'm afraid I don't recognise those figures. I
was also surprised by them, but
thirdly,
that's the form in which the question came in.
It is fantastic that Russia, has a carbon sink. It's really important that Russia, and indeed all countries, work to increase the capacity of absorption of their forests and their peat bogs and so on. But again, that's not just about Russia, that's about everywhere.
There's fog and storm and waves in the English Channel, so once again Europe is separated from England. But are you in the same boat on that?
I would like to look at the question from a different angle, if I may. We have said many times that there is no contradiction between CO2 reductions and environment protection and economic growth. So when we encourage all countries to reduce their emissions, we are not encouraging all countries to get poorer. On the contrary, to embrace the green transition towards a more sustainable economy. And I mentioned that we have several bilateral cooperation exams with Russia. And for example, we have Enel building wind farms here, 4 in different areas of Russia. We have a group called Kavanya. They are producing together in joint venture with Gazprom household systems, CNG conversion kits in Russia to convert engine into gas propelled from petrol to gas. And then we in Vixa we have an Italian company, Danieli, that together with the OMK company, they have created a new plant where they can produce green iron units, reducing by 70% CO2 emissions. And the moment they will be able to use hydrogen, they will produce CO2 neutral iron units. So this is the way, I think, to proceed together, combining economic growth and environment protection.
Более того, я к этому добавлю то, что за последний год в очень разных.
I would also add that during the last year, in many parts of Russian Federation, we have experimented with the renewable energy, and they have proved to be more economically efficient. For instance, in Bashkortostan Republic, it has proved to be much more economically efficient and to use sun energy. The same with Gorno-Altaysk city. Wind energy is used in Dagestan and Kalmykia, so we need to understand that people in the West sometimes think that Russia only uses oil and gas, but actually no, we have been using renewable energy, and energy balance is one of the best in Russia, and the combination of traditional and non-traditional energy sources has always been present in Russia. So let us speak about the Americans. Will the Americans be in Glasgow?
and I'm not a voter in those elections. So we will have to see who the American people choose to be their president, and obviously we will want to work with whoever the American people choose. And of course, the two leading candidates have different climate policies, so the way that we work with them will be different because of the democratic choices that the US will make tomorrow.
Руслан, ну, англичан с американцами традиционно разделяют общий язык, а вот...
Of course, people in the UK and people in the US speak quite a different language, don't they? Ruslan, you have spoken to people from the US a lot. Have you been able to see eye to eye with them? I must mention an important thing, that we never intervene and never meddle the elections, never meddle the elections, and have no relation to it at all. Speaking about our climate policy, our attitudes towards climate issues are quite the same. And whilst we have a lot of disagreements in other spheres, we see eye to eye in climate issues with the US, with Saudi Arabia, with China. So this is the question where we do see eye to eye with one another. If you allow me, I would love to come back to the question that we have mentioned before. As you mentioned, I have been speaking about climate issues and economy, because there is a thin line which sometimes is left unnoticed by the community. When people say that one company purchases the technology from another company, they are competing, but one company is purchasing technologies from another company. So we're back to the issues that are all around money. But the thing is that when a company do not have access to technologies, do not have access to finance, they are a bit stuck. Countries in Africa and other developing states are the ones who suffer the most from the consequences of the climate change, because the level of the ocean is rising and they are the first who notice it. So on the one hand, we do keep asking them, please do reduce CO2 emissions. And they ask us questions stating that historically, the developed countries, were the ones responsible for this industrialization, and now you are not giving us subsidiaries. So we don't have enough financing. You're also not giving us technologies, and yet you're demanding us to reduce CO2 emissions. So when we're speaking about all those innovations, electric vehicles, and other impressive achievements, we still have the developing countries left aside. Let's think about these thin lines and let's pay attention to them. Either we're speaking about climate change or we're speaking about economy and the development for the humanity. Are we creating two different groups of developed and developing countries, or are we all together working on climate change? I think we should be really careful with this issue and pay attention, because the community might sometimes not understand the discussion we're having here. I have been involved in this topic for 2 years. I have been paying attention to all these details, and I do understand where we have this right approach to climate change and where people are just kind of fooling around it. So I wanted to emphasize once again that Russia, taking into consideration that we have our forests, our resources, we do understand that we have potential for various projects in energy efficiency. I'm not really worried. We do have high potential in this sphere, but there is business on another side. Whether there are forests or there are no forests, business still can be affected when we lack finance, when we trace the carbon footprint, when we speak about aviation, marine transportation, other logistical issues. All this violates the rules of the World Trade Organization. Of course, it is important for the community and biodiversity, but there is a saying in Russian that we can reach it, indeed, but the competition will be tough. And this question might take us a very long time, like 10 years, to solve it. So I'm calling upon the international community to think about this question in each and every detail, to think about it really attentively, and not to make others players. There are people who do one thing and say another thing. Unfortunately, COVID-19 has stolen a year from us. We have to reevaluate our attitudes towards things. We see how powerless we can be towards the change that can happen globally. But still, let us reevaluate our thoughts and principles which we base our actions on when we care for our planet, when we care for people, for economies. Let's think about future generations. Let's speak about developing countries. And let's come to Glasgow with having a lot of thought before.
Нашей пресс-конференции. Но если у кого-то есть желание сделать финал.
Well, I believe that was a good conclusion to the conference, unless someone wants to make any final remarks. I don't want this press conference to substitute for Glasgow, but if anyone would like to add a few closing remarks.
Maybe I should just say that I think the point about developing countries is a really powerful one and really important. And that is one of the reasons since the early 90s, when the world started to look at these issues, there's been a separate set of requirements and a tougher set of requirements on the developed world than the developing world, and that is right, because it's the developing world that have borne the brunt of the changing climate, and I think that's really important for all of us who are from the developed or the more developed part of the world to remember. Certainly from the United Kingdom's perspective, we have continued to be a major contributor to the major funds that are designed to help poorer countries adapt and mitigate to the impacts of climate. And we've just announced that we will double our climate finance for mitigation and adaptation to £11.6 billion from 2021 to 2025, precisely because it's so important that we approach this from a position of equity and fairness. If I may, to conclude, we are asking all countries to step up and increase their ambition. We have invited parties to this virtual summit on the 12th of December because we want countries to come with increased ambition so that we can make good use of the year that we've lost to COVID, the delay that we've had to Glasgow. But of course we are asking ourselves exactly the same questions, and I think it's important that we are all asking ourselves exactly the same questions. But it's not a choice. We're not saying that we should be poorer. We're asking about how can we achieve sustainable economic growth in a way that preserves our planet for future generations and for ourselves.
That's it?
Yeah,
that's it. Well, Nigel, thank you so much indeed in Devonshire.
Спасибо большое.
Спасибо большое из Москвы.
Thank you very much from Moscow. Thank you very much to all participants, and looking ahead to Glasgow.